The fluorescent lights above the long hallway of St. Catherine's Community Hospital gave one quiet flicker that night, and that small flicker was the last peaceful thing that hallway would ever know. A thin woman in a faded blue cardigan stood near the nurse's station with her hands folded in front of her, a printed discharge paper in one trembling hand, and the kind of stillness in her eyes that most people simply walked past without noticing. Then a man in a $5,000 suit stepped forward from behind the front desk, raised his right hand, and struck her hard across the cheek with the open palm of his hand. The sound of it hit the walls like a single gunshot in an empty barn. He leaned close and told her to get out and to never come back. Outside, just past the ambulance bay, the deep rhythmic thump of helicopter blades began to drift through the glass doors, and the entire building seemed to stop breathing for a moment. It was just past 6 o'clock in the evening on a slow Tuesday in early spring, and the kind of rain that barely falls but never quite stops had been hovering over the city since morning. The hospital sat on the east side of town, where the old neighborhoods met the newer office buildings, a place built in the 1970s with thick walls, narrow windows, and lighting that had been updated just enough to pass inspection, but never enough to feel new. The lobby smelled faintly of floor cleaner and coffee, and the soft antiseptic smell that every hospital carries in its walls no matter how many times you paint over them. Visitors drifted in and out under the glass awning, some carrying flowers, some carrying children, some carrying the quiet look on their faces that meant they had been here too many times already. Nurses moved in soft shoes between the hallways, doctors walked with coffee cups half raised like tired soldiers, and the front desk staff tried to look busy, even though the lobby was nearly empty. St. Catherine's had always been a working hospital, the kind of place where the everyday people of the city came when they were sick, and it had always been staffed by people who cared. But 3 months earlier, a new chief executive officer had arrived from a private healthcare company in Chicago, a young man named Richard Grave who had been brought in to cut costs, raise prices, and turn the hospital into something the board of directors could sell at a profit. He did not know the patients. He did not know the nurses. He did not know what the walls of this building had quietly witnessed. And he did not know the thin woman he had just struck. She had asked a simple question at the front desk that afternoon. She had asked about her veteran benefits and a small co-pay that she could not afford at the end of the month. Her name was Patricia Dawn Mallory, though almost no one in that lobby called her by her first name. To the nurses who had known her for years, she was simply Miss Pat, a quiet older woman who had been coming into the oncology ward every Tuesday and every Thursday for almost a year, slowly walking the long hallway with a cane in her right hand and a small cloth bag over her shoulder, the kind of bag a schoolteacher might carry. She wore the same blue cardigan most days. She wore soft shoes. She wore her silver hair pulled back in a plain ponytail. She never raised her voice. She never asked for much. She nodded politely when people spoke to her, and she always thanked the janitor when he passed by in the morning. Anyone who looked at her would have seen a humble retired schoolteacher or a retired postal worker, the kind of grandmother who bakes cookies for the neighbors and never misses a Sunday service. No one who looked at her would have ever guessed the life she had lived before she ever set foot inside this building. If stories like this one touch something inside you, consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss another one. And if a moment in this story moves you, leave a short word like Semper Fi or never forget in the comments, because every story we share here honors a real warrior in spirit, and every view you give carries that honor a little further down the road. Patricia had not been a teacher. Patricia had not been a postal worker. Patricia had been a United States Navy officer for 22 years, a woman who had walked onto a recruitment bus in Nashville, Tennessee in the spring of 1971, at the age of 19, a woman whose father had wept in the parking lot and whose mother had held her shoulders for a long moment before letting go. She had served as a Navy nurse, then as a lieutenant commander in charge of a trauma unit that moved with Marines through the highlands of Vietnam in the late winter and early spring of 1972. She had held the hands of dying boys who looked younger than her youngest brother. She had helped deliver babies in the back of a Huey as the rotor blades beat against the red Nye. T-Sky, she had been awarded the Bronze Star for uncommon valor in 1973 for running through a barrage of incoming rounds to reach 3 wounded Marines trapped in a collapsing rice paddy bunker. She had sewn up a young corporal named James Whitfield with nothing but a flashlight between her teeth and a handful of battle dressings while enemy fire passed so close, it ripped the sleeve of her uniform. She had carried that memory for 50 years without ever telling her neighbors, her church group, or the nurses who had grown fond of her here. The only proof she carried with her today was a small worn set of dog tags she kept in the bottom of her cloth bag, 2 cold metal tags on a thin silver chain, the kind of tags that had hung around the necks of every sailor and marine she had ever tried to save. She had been discharged from the Navy in 1989 with full honours after a quiet career that left her body racked with the early signs of the cancer that was now eating at her from the inside. She had moved to this small city because it was cheap and quiet and far away from anywhere anyone in the Veterans Administration could bother her. She did not want to be thanked. She did not want to be honoured. She did not want anyone to know that the quiet older woman who rode the city bus on Tuesday mornings had once carried a wounded Marine on her back through a field of gunfire. She had lived alone since her husband Daniel passed away in 2010, a gentle man who had been a Marine himself and who had understood exactly what she carried inside and had never once made her speak about it. She had one daughter who lived 2 states away and called her every Sunday evening, and she had 2 grandchildren who sent her crayon drawings in the mail that she kept pinned above her kitchen sink. Patricia had lived a quiet life. Patricia had asked for nothing. Patricia had walked into St. Catherine's Community Hospital that Tuesday afternoon, expecting to receive a routine scan and to ask a simple question about her co-pay. And she had no idea that the question she was about to ask would put her face to face with a man who had never once in his young life been taught to respect his elders or to honour the uniform of a sailor. If the courage of this woman has reached you even before the story has fully unfolded, consider tapping the subscribe button so you can walk through the rest of this journey with us. And if a quiet prayer for her has crossed your mind, leave a word like stay strong or never forgotten in the comments below. Because every kind word left on this channel is one more flag planted in honour of warriors we will never forget. The young chief executive officer stood 6 feet 1 inch tall and carried a firm handshake and a haircut that cost more than most of the nurses in his building earned in a week. His name was Richard Grave, and he was 34 years old, and he wore the title Chief Executive Officer on a small silver pin above his left chest pocket that had been hand-engraved by a jeweler in Chicago. He had been hired by the St. Catherine's Board of Directors 9 weeks earlier with a signing bonus that none of the medical staff would ever see on their own paychecks. He had been brought in to modernize, to streamline, to balance the budget. He had not been brought in to care. He did not know what the word veteran meant in this country. He did not understand why the hospital kept a small wooden plaque in the lobby listing the names of former staff members who had served in the armed forces. He called it sentimental clutter. He had already begun laying off older nurses. He had already begun replacing floor staff with part-time contractors. He had already begun treating his lobby like a hotel desk instead of a hospital front line, and the patients like inconveniences that slowed down his morning coffee. He had walked out from his back office that Tuesday afternoon because the front desk manager had waved him over, and he had walked across the lobby with his hands in his pockets, and his eyes barely glancing at the thin older woman standing near the nurse's station, clutching her printed discharge paper. Patricia had asked her question in the softest possible voice. She had asked why her veteran co-pay had been raised without notice from $20 to $90, and why the social worker she had spoken with last month was no longer returning her phone calls. She had not raised her voice. She had not asked for any compensation. She had not even raised her eyes to look directly at him when he first walked up to the front desk. She had only asked for an answer in plain words that a tired old woman could understand. But the chief executive officer had looked at her discharge paper, looked at her faded blue cardigan, looked at the small cloth bag by her feet, looked at her worn brown shoes that had been resold 3 times at the same shop downtown, and he had decided in that single moment that she was just another confused elderly patient who did not understand the new billing system. He had spoken to her the way he had been taught to speak to patients in his business school lectures. He had used short words and a flat voice. He had told her that the co-pay was simply the new policy. He had told her that the social worker had been let go. He had told her that she could take her business to another hospital if she did not like it here. And when she had gently asked to speak with the patient advocate, the way she had every right to do under federal law, something inside him had snapped in a way he would regret for the rest of his life, although he did not yet know it. If you have stayed this far into the story already, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is built for, so take a second to subscribe so the next story finds you the moment it goes live. And drop a short word in the comments like Semper Fi or Honor and remember, because every comment you leave here is a quiet salute from one grateful heart to another. The hallway went completely still. The young nurse behind the desk froze with her hand halfway to her phone. The janitor with the mop pressed his lips together and looked down at his shoes. The doctor walking past with his coffee stopped in mid-step and watched in quiet disbelief. The chief executive officer raised his right hand and struck Patricia Mallory hard across the left side of her face with the open palm of his hand. The sound of it hit the walls of the lobby like a single gunshot in a quiet barn. Patricia stumbled back one step and caught herself against the wooden railing near the nurse's station. Her glasses fell to the floor and cracked under her feet. Her discharge paper fluttered out of her hand and slid across the tile to rest near the doorway. She did not cry out. She did not fall. She straightened her cardigan with one trembling hand and tucked a loose strand of silver hair back behind her ear, and she looked at the young man who had just struck her with a look on her face that held no anger, no surprise, and no fear. She looked at him the way a commanding officer looks at a recruit who has just made a terrible mistake, calm and steady and deeply disappointed. Something about that look made him take one small step back. Something about the silence of the room made him realize, somewhere deep inside his chest, that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. A young nurse named Carla Reynolds, who had just started working the evening shift 2 weeks earlier, picked up her phone behind the desk with hands that were shaking badly. She did not know Patricia Mallory. She did not know her story. She did not know what the quiet older woman had done half a world away in a country most people in this city had long forgotten about. But Carla Reynolds had grown up in a Navy family, had a father who had served on an aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf, and had an uncle who was still serving as a Navy captain stationed in San Diego. She could feel inside her bones that what had just happened in that lobby was wrong. She picked up her phone, and she made a call that she had been told never to make from a hospital line, but she did not care anymore. She dialed her uncle's cell phone number from memory. When he answered, she said only that there had been an incident with a veteran in a community hospital in this part of the country, and that a hospital executive had struck an older woman across the face. She asked if her uncle could help. She gave him the name of the hospital, the name of the chief executive officer, and the name she had read on the discharge paper in the older woman's trembling hand. Her uncle had worked in Veterans Affairs for almost 20 years. Her uncle knew exactly what to do with that information. Within 40 minutes of the phone call, an email had gone out from a commander at the United States Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington, D.C., to several Navy public affairs officers on the West Coast. Within 90 minutes, the office of a Rear Admiral at Naval Base San Diego had placed a call to the hospital's main switchboard. And somewhere high above the Pacific Ocean, a Navy MH-60 Seahawk helicopter with a small American flag painted on its tail section had begun warming up on the flight deck of a hospital ship that was just finishing a humanitarian mission along the coast. If this story is pulling at something deep inside you, take a moment right now to subscribe so you never miss a story like this, and leave a quiet word in the comments like "never forget" or "they served, so we could live." Because every comment left on this channel is a small candle kept burning for a warrior who cannot light one for themselves. Back inside the lobby, no one had moved. The chief executive officer had retreated to his private glass office on the second floor and had closed his door behind him with both hands shaking faintly at his sides. He hospital's director of nursing, a soft-spoken woman named Linda Sato who had worked in this building for 28 years, had quietly walked Patricia to a quiet waiting room off to the side and had pressed a cold, wet cloth into her trembling hands and had asked her if she was okay in a voice that almost broke on the second word. Patricia had nodded softly and had said she had seen worse in her life. Linda Sato had looked at her with eyes that filled with tears and had said quietly that someone was coming from Washington, but Patricia had simply shaken her head and told her that no one needed to come and that everything was fine. Linda had looked at the discharge paper lying crumpled on the floor near the doorway and had seen the words printed in small block letters near the top. The words had listed her patient classification as military veteran, service-connected disability, Bronze Star recipient, Vietnam era. Linda had looked back at the thin older woman sitting in the quiet waiting room with a cold cloth pressed to her cheek and had felt the full weight of what had just happened in her hospital settle heavy on her shoulders. She had walked quickly to her office and had placed a phone call of her own. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and a low marine layer of fog had drifted in from the coast and was sitting low against the tops of the surrounding buildings. The hospital's small helicopter pad sat at the back of the parking lot behind a chain-link fence and a pair of rusted sliding gates that had not been opened in almost 6 years, because the hospital had stopped accepting critical patient transfers 2 chief executive officers ago. The chain on the gates had been cut by 2 paramedics on duty who had heard the whispers spreading through the building and had known deep in their hearts that whatever was about to happen on that pad needed to happen fast. They had parked a working ambulance near the gates and had switched on its rooftop lights, so the helicopter would have a clear visual marker in the fog. The nurses on the upper floors had begun to drift to the windows, without saying a word to one another. The security guard at the front desk had stepped outside and had looked up into the low grey sky and had felt the deep rumble of approaching rotors working its way into his chest. And then, just before 7 o'clock that evening, with the fog hanging low over the parking lot and the ambulance lights flashing slow and steady against the wet pavement, a Navy MH-60 Seahawk helicopter came down out of the clouds in a slow, controlled descent, with 2 stars painted on its tail section and a single small American flag fluttering just behind the cockpit window. The sound of its rotors hit the hospital walls like a slow drum, and the entire building seemed to lift just slightly off its foundation before settling back down again. The helicopter touched the pad with a soft bounce and a small puff of fog, and its engines spooled down to a low idle, and the side door slid open even before the wheels had fully stopped turning. If you have felt something stir inside you while reading this story, take a quiet moment right now to subscribe so you stay with this channel for the next chapter of this woman's life. And leave one short word in the comments below like stay strong or honor and remember, because every comment left here is a small candle lit for a warrior whose courage most people will never fully understand. 3 people stepped out of the helicopter and walked across the wet pavement toward the hospital entrance with the kind of purpose that only uniformed service members carry in their stride. The first was a Navy captain named Marcus Whitfield, a tall man in his early 50s with the build of a wrestler and a face that looked like it had been carved out of weathered oak. He had been a young Marine corporal in Vietnam in the spring of 1972, and the woman he had come to find had been the Navy nurse who had sewn him back together under enemy fire 54 years earlier in a collapsing rice paddy bunker that smelled of burning rice and copper and fear. He had been retired for 9 years and now served as a senior advisor at the Department of Veterans Affairs. He had received the phone call at 6:43 that evening. He had not hesitated. The second was a younger Navy lieutenant commander named Sophia Reyes, a public affairs officer who had been dispatched to ensure that whatever happened inside the hospital was handled with dignity and discretion. The third was a Navy hospital corpsman second class named Devon Walker, 23 years old, who had been chosen at the last minute to be part of the visit because his own grandmother had been a Vietnam-era Navy nurse, and because he had been the one to volunteer when no one else had stepped forward. They walked through the sliding glass doors of the hospital lobby in full service uniform, medals polished, hats in hand, eyes dry. GHT ahead, and the entire lobby went completely silent the moment the first boot crossed the threshold. Captain Whitfield stopped in the middle of the lobby and looked around at the faces of the nurses and the security staff and the doctors who had gathered near the hallway, and he asked in a quiet, steady voice to be taken to Miss Patricia Mallory. The lobby staff looked at his uniform and at the 2 stars on his shoulder, and at the polished bronze star above his left pocket, and at the single purple heart he wore low near his heart, and they stepped aside without a single word. He was led into the small waiting room where Patricia had been sitting quietly with the cold cloth still pressed to her cheek and the cracked glasses folded in her lap. Captain Whitfield stopped in the doorway for a long moment and looked at her, and the look on his face was the look of a man who had just come face to face after 54 years with the single human being who had pulled him back from the edge of death, in a place that no one in this hospital had ever heard of and no one in this city would ever visit. He walked forward slowly, he removed his service hat with both hands, he held it against his chest, and he stood at attention in front of her chair with tears running quietly down the weathered lines of his face. He said nothing for a long moment, then he spoke her name. He told her quietly that he was Corporal James Marcus Whitfield of the United States Marine Corps, that he had been 18 years old in March of 1972, that she had pulled him out of a collapsing bunker, that she had held his intestines inside his body with nothing but her bare hands, that she had sewn him back together in the dark, that she had carried him on her back through a hail of enemy fire to a waiting helicopter, that her Bronze Star citation named him as the first life she had ever saved in combat, and that he had spent the entire 54 years since that night searching for the name of the woman who had given him back his life. He told her that he had finally found her name in a hospital database 2 hours earlier, and that he had come to find her because the debt he owed her could never be paid in any currency that existed on Earth. If this story has stayed with you through every line so far, take a quiet moment to subscribe so you can keep walking beside this woman through the rest of her journey, and leave one short word in the comments like never forget or honor and courage, because every comment left here is a real salute from one grateful heart to another warrior who served in silence. The room had gone completely still, and the only sound anyone could hear was the soft ticking of the wall clock behind the door and the slow, steady breathing of the woman who had been sitting quietly in that waiting room for nearly an hour. Patricia Mallory looked up at the tall Navy captain standing in front of her with his hat pressed against his chest and his medals shining under the fluorescent lights, and a single tear slid slowly down the right side of her face. She did not speak for a long, quiet moment. She simply reached slowly into the small cloth bag at her feet and pulled out the worn set of dog tags she had carried in silence for almost 54 years, the 2 cold metal tags that had hung around her neck on a helicopter pad in Vietnam while she had held a dying young Marine together with her bare hands. She placed them gently into the captain's open palm, and she told him quietly that she had carried his name in her pocket every single day of her life since that night in 1972, and that she had always wondered if he had made it home. Captain Whitfield could not speak for several long seconds. He folded the dog tags carefully into his palm and held them against his heart, and he bowed his head, and the other officers in the doorway bowed their heads with him, and the nurses behind them bowed their heads too, and the soft sound of quiet crying drifted through the small waiting room and out into the hallway where it mixed with the slow ticking of the clock and the low hum of the hospital building. If the weight of this moment has reached something deep inside you, take a quiet second to subscribe so this story stays with you until the last line, and leave a single short word in the comments below like Semper Fi or Stay Strong, because every comment you leave here is one more candle lit for a warrior who walked through fire and never once asked to be thanked for it. Across the city in the back office on the 2nd floor, the chief executive officer was sitting behind his glass desk with his hands pressed against his forehead and his tie loosened at his collar, watching through the open window of his office as the Navy officers walked through the lobby below. He had heard the rotors of the helicopter land outside. He had felt the building shake when the wheels touched the pad. He had walked to the window of High's office and looked down at the MH-60 Seahawk with the 2 stars on its tail and the small American flag fluttering behind the cockpit, and something in his stomach had dropped faster than he could explain. Within 30 minutes, the Chief of Staff at the Department of Veterans Affairs had placed a private call to the chairman of the St. Catherine's Board of Directors, who had immediately placed a private call to the Chief Medical Officer of the hospital, who had immediately placed a steady hand on the Chief Executive Officer's shoulder, and had asked him in a quiet voice to step away from his desk and into a small conference room at the end of the hall. The Board of Directors had begun an emergency session by phone within the hour. 3 senior partners at the law firm that represented the hospital had been quietly retained to begin an internal review. The Chief Executive Officer had not yet been formally terminated, but the writing had already begun to appear on the walls of his office in a language he had never been taught to read. He had spent the last 9 weeks in this building, believing that what he was doing was modernizing an outdated institution. He had begun to realize in the silence of that small conference room that what he had been doing was slowly eviscerating the quiet human dignity of every person who walked through those doors. And he had struck across the face a woman who had carried a young Marine through a field of enemy fire 54 years ago, because she could not stand by and watch another human being die alone in the dark. If this moment has not left your chest yet, consider taking a quiet second to subscribe so that this channel keeps being a place where stories like hers are honored, and leave a single short word in the comments below like Semper Fi or Stay Strong, because every word left on this channel is a small act of remembrance for a warrior whose courage most people will never fully understand. But the bigger truth, the truth that no news report or press release could ever carry, was already spreading quietly through the hallways of that hospital like a slow, warm tide. The young nurse named Carla Reynolds had stepped outside in the parking lot and had placed a quiet phone call to her mother, who had called her aunt, who had called a cousin who served in the Army Reserve, who had posted a small message on a veterans support group on Facebook that asked anyone who knew a Navy nurse named Patricia Dawn Mallory to reach out as soon as they could. Within 6 hours, More than 900 current and retired service members had responded with messages and photos and old unit rosters, and tattered copies of morning reports from 1972 and 1973. Within 24 hours, a small private archive had been quietly assembled on a flash drive and had been printed out in a thin binder that sat on the Director of Nursing's desk the next morning. The pages inside listed the names of 9 Marines who had been pulled out of rice paddy bunkers by Patricia Mallory between March of 1972 and January of 1973. The pages listed 7 Navy corpsmen she had taught to work under fire. The pages listed 3 Bronze Star recommendations that had been filed in her name and finally approved in the autumn of 1973, the third of which she had never known about because the paperwork had been quietly lost in a clerical shuffle 30 miles behind the front lines. The pages listed the names and ages of the 18 babies she had delivered in the back of field helicopters between 1971 and 1973, several of whom were now serving on active duty in the United States Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps in 2025. The pages listed the names and ages of 62 Marines and Navy corpsmen who had survived the war because of her hands and her steady voice and her stubborn refusal to leave a wounded man behind even when the rounds were falling so close, they were tearing the canvas of the helicopters she was loading them into. If the weight of this larger truth is sitting heavy in your chest, take a quiet moment to subscribe so you can stay with this channel for the final chapter of this story. And leave one short word in the comments like never forget or honor and remember, because every comment left here is a real salute from one grateful stranger to another warrior whose name most people will never know. On the morning of the 3rd day after the helicopter landed, a small private ceremony was held in the chapel on the 1st floor of St. Catherine's Community Hospital. The hospital's CEO had been formally suspended the night before with full pay pending an internal review, but he had been quietly asked not to attend the ceremony by the board of directors, who had been advised in firm language by counsel that his presence would constitute a public relations error of history. Proportions. The chapel held no more than 40 seats, and every single one had been quietly filled before 8 o'clock that morning. Patricia Mallory sat in the front row in the same faded blue cardigan she had been wearing when she had been struck across the face in the lobby, and her hair had been combed back into a fresh ponytail by one of the younger nurses from the oncology ward who had come in on her day off, just to help her get ready. Captain Whitfield sat beside her in full dress uniform with his medals pinned to his chest and the worn dog tags of Patricia Mallory tucked into his left breast pocket above his heart. Around them sat the nurses who had cared for her for almost a year. Around them sat the doctors who had consulted on her case. Around them sat the janitors and the security staff and the kitchen staff, who had quietly slipped her extra coffee and small sandwiches at the back of the cafeteria line for months, because they had loved her without ever asking why. And standing along the back wall with their hats in their hands were the members of the small Navy Public Affairs delegation who had flown east on a charter flight the day before, along with 2 young Marines in dress blues who had been dispatched from a nearby reserve unit on 4 hours' notice, because their commanding officer had known that somewhere in that chapel sat the woman who had carried their grandfathers home from Vietnam on her own back. If this moment has reached something inside you that words alone cannot touch, take a quiet second to subscribe so this channel keeps being a place where stories like hers are honored every week, and leave one short word in the comments like never forget or honor and remember, because every comment left here is a real salute from one grateful heart to another warrior who walked through fire and never once asked to be thanked. The Director of Nursing read Patricia's Bronze Star citation, aloud in a steady voice from a single sheet of paper that had been quietly retrieved from the National Archives in Washington, D.C., the day before. She read it slowly and with full dignity, and when she came to the paragraph that named the young corporal she had saved in the rice paddy bunker, Captain Whitfield stood up from his chair beside Patricia and rendered a slow hand salute that held for 30 full seconds while the small chapel sat in silence. Then he stepped forward. He pinned a small bronze insignia onto the left shoulder of her faded cardigan with hands that were shaking visibly, and he stepped back and saluted her again. The insignia was the Navy's Nurse Corps officer device that she had earned in 1971 and had quietly returned to the Secretary of the Navy in 1989 when she had been honorably discharged. The Secretary of the Navy had quietly signed an order restoring the insignia to her name the afternoon before. Patricia looked down at the small bronze pin resting on her worn blue cardigan, and a single deep breath caught in her chest, and she reached slowly for Captain Whitfield's hand and held it in both of hers, and did not let go for a long, quiet moment. She did not speak. She did not need to speak. The room already understood what she was saying. And when she finally looked up, she looked around at every face in that small chapel one by one with a quiet nod and a soft, steady smile. And she thanked them all in a voice that was barely above a whisper. And she told them gently that the best reward of her life had always been that the young men she had once carried home were still alive to stand in a room like this and remember her name. If this story has stayed with you through every line, take a quiet second to subscribe and to share this video with one person whose heart needs to hear it today, and leave one final word in the comments below like Semper Fi or Never Forgotten. Because every soldier, sailor, airman and marine who ever wore the uniform carries a story like this one inside them. And every comment you leave is one more candle lit in their honor tonight. Patricia Mallory passed away 4 months later in the oncology ward of St. Catherine's Community Hospital, in the same room where she had received her treatments for almost 2 years, with her daughter and her 2 grandchildren holding her hands and Captain Whitfield sitting quietly beside her bed in full uniform with his hat held against his chest and her worn dog tags folded into his palm. The hospital flew its flag at half-staff for 3 days. The nurses who had cared for her for years stood a quiet on a watch at the door of her room for the entire night before her funeral. The chief executive officer was formally terminated 2 weeks after the incident, and his name was quietly removed from the brass donor plaque in the lobby by an order of the board of directors that did not make the local news. And on the morning of the small private burial at the Veterans Cemetery on the hill south of Tow, a Navy flyover of 3 MH-60 Seahawk helicopters passed over the cemetery in slow formation, as the rifle detail fired 3 volleys into the cold spring air, and the bugler played taps with a steady voice that could be heard 3 blocks away by the old men sitting on their porches who all stood up without being asked. The headstone that was placed above her grave was a simple flat granite marker with only her name, her rank, her dates of service, and the small symbol of the bronze star carved into the upper right corner. There was no long list of medals. There was no long list of citations. There was no mention of the 18 babies she had delivered in the back of helicopters or the 62 Marines she had carried home from the field or the single moment in March of 1972 that had given a young corporal the chance to grow into a man who would one day become a captain. None of that was on the headstone. None of that needed to be. The headstone did not need to tell her story. The headstone only needed to tell people where she was buried. Her story, the real one, the one that mattered, was now being carried quietly in the palms and the memories and the morning prayers of every single living soul she had ever touched along the way. And that is the truth that no headstone can hold. That is the truth that no plaque can measure. That is the truth that lives forever in the steady hands of every warrior who ever walked through fire and never once asked the world to know their name.